Unit 4, Period 4. Today we're going to discuss the presidency of Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson was our first Democratic president, leader of the Democratic Party. Andrew Jackson was a hero of the War of 1812, specifically the Battle of New Orleans, and so he was a well known American. He's the seventh president of the United States, and he brings about what is known as Jacksonian democracy, uh, a very strong presidency. Andrew Jackson had lost the previous election in 1824 to John Quincy Adams. This election frustrated Jackson because he felt like there were a lot of white men who were not able to vote for him because they did not own property in their states. And so between 1824 and 1828, Jackson led the Democrats to get the states to change their voting procedures to allow white men who did not own property to vote in the 1828 election. This becomes known as universal manhood suffrage, and that is that from this point on, all white men could vote regardless of property qualifications. Another part of Jacksonian democracy, which really increased the power of his presidency, and this cartoon here makes fun of the fact that people refer to Andrew Jackson as King Andrew, was the rise of popular political culture. Jackson was the first man to actually run for president. His party, for example, had buttons made with Jackson's likeness on it that were given out to potential voters in elections. Another aspect of popular political culture was posters published by the political party to encourage people to vote for their candidate. Here it says that Jackson is a man of the people. Another example of Jacksonian democracy is negative campaigning. John Quincy Adams' Nationalist Party published this poster, and it glorified or demonized Jackson for being a murderer and killing men in duels and beating his troops when he was in command of the American army, or having his troops beaten. And so this demonized or made Jackson uh, not look like a good candidate for president of the United States. They also, the nationalists, not John Quincy Adams, but his political party, attacked Jackson's wife in the press as not being a very nice woman, and this angered Jackson tremendously. Jackson had killed men in duels, which was legal back then, but the use by the nationalists as part of popular political culture backfired on them because a lot of Americans felt like that Jackson was just defending his honor, and so they voted for Jackson. The main thing you need to know about the rise of popular political culture is the first time in American history where we see campaigning and politics used well and also negatively. The third aspect of Jacksonian democracy is the continuance of the idea of nationalism. Jackson, even though he's a strong president, um, an example of this is his veto of a road project that Kentucky wanted to build called the Maysville Road. Jackson vetoed this plan because, as you can see from the map here, the road was only going to be built in the state of Kentucky and not connect more than one state together, so he vetoed it. He also, as an example of nationalism, uh, removed Native Americans from the uh, eastern part of the United States and what became known as the Trail of Tears. And this was a forced march west of the Mississippi River by the United States Army of the five civilized tribes in the eastern part of the United States. This was old men, women, children, and they were just forced to move west of the Mississippi River because white Americans wanted their land. And then the last example is where Jackson sort of goes against the nationalist ideas because he's a states' rights guy. He takes all the money out of the national bank and puts that in state banks because he believed that money needed to be seen by the people. And since we were such a large country, the banks needed to be at the state level. And this is a political cartoon used in newspapers at the time, illustrating Jackson with a knife, and he's cutting the head, the many-headed monster, known as the National Bank. He's slaying it. This leads us to the next part of Unit 4, Section 4, Jackson's presidency, and this is the beginning of the development of sectionalism. Sectionalism is the idea that states have rights that the national government does not have. And even in the Constitution, the 10th Amendment says that powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution nor prohibited to the states are reserved to the states. And this is where the idea of states' rights comes from, and it's born during Jackson's presidency because he was a strong supporter of nationalism, yet also states' rights with the idea of state banks. And so sectionalism becomes the interests of the South and the West become different of that of the North, illustrated here in blue. And this idea of sectionalism is going to be one of the eventual causes of the Civil War. The best example of this is John C. Calhoun. John C. Calhoun was vice president to Andrew Jackson and was such a proponent of states' rights that when the national government attempted to place a tariff on manufactured goods brought into the United States to protect American industry, which would help the areas in purple and green, the John C. Calhoun resigns as vice president of the United States. He was a citizen of South Carolina, and he felt like all the tariff was going to do is force the consumers in South Carolina to pay higher prices since the South did not have a lot of industry that would be protected by the tariff. So he goes back to his home state of South Carolina and calls for a concept known as nullification. And you need to know what that term means. Nullification means to ignore an act of the national government, and in this case, the tariff. South Carolina, led by John C. Calhoun, was going to ignore the tariff of 1828. So right here in your notes, make sure that you write in the nickname of the tariff of 1828, which was called the Tariff of Abominations. An abomination is just a terrible, terrible thing. And so this demonstrates how badly the South hated tariffs because they thought that it was just going to help American industry in the North, and they were not going to get a benefit from the tariff because they were the consumers, and the consumers would just pay higher prices.